Peace family, welcome to African Esquire TV. I'm your host, Tony Cherie. Before we get started with today's video, if you're watching on my YouTube channel, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and also hit the notification button. In addition, please add yourself to my Telegram channel. Telegram is decentralized and it is not controlled by these corporate giants, and so I update it regularly. Anytime I'm doing a speaking engagement, anytime I'm posting a video, anything like that. Also, please add yourself to my Odyssey channel. Odyssey is my backup channel, just in case, my YouTube can get shut down, as any of ours can. So it's just good to have a backup. The links to both are going to be in the description. I don't know if you all have been watching this past week, but there's been a lot of talks about climate change inside of Africa. Now, we're going to talk about this, but we're going to talk about it in a very specific way, understanding that climate change at this point is really driven primarily by Western powers. They are the ones that are emitting the most carbon emissions. They are the ones that are hoarding the most resources. They are the ones that are just mercilessly wasting. And so Africans, once again, are left inside of the most depraved position just because of their relationship to the West being the one who occupies the resources, the West being the one who occupies the riches, and it has been driving the African continent completely backwards, unfortunately. So we're going to talk about this, and it's very important that we start thinking more about climate, because I know it sounds kind of like a cliche at this point, climate change, but it actually comes down to real numbers of people who are dying, and people who presently dying, people who will die, if we don't do something very revolutionary soon, and also people who are just going to be driven to move outside of their homes, their neighborhoods, their communities, because of this horrible crisis. So I hope that it becomes more real to us that although it's kind of become a cliche that we associate with a lot of white organizations, we should personalize this as something that's going on with us, because number one, it's not our fault. We're not the drivers behind climate change. Not saying there's no Africans that are, emitting carbon emissions to the atmosphere. We know some, but it's pales in comparison to other countries. And not only that, though, but we should also understand that not only are we not the ones doing it, we're the ones that are suffering the most. So that's what we're going to talk about today, as well as some other stories. So let's just start with the article. Climate change could start forcing millions of Africans out of their homes within the next 9 years. And that's what the World Bank is reporting. We know the World Bank is an institution. It's a colonial institution. So anytime that we get any type of information from a colonial institution, we have to take it with a grain of salt. But I do think that this type of narrative would go contrary to the interest of the West, because if Africa is the one suffering the most, that's something that they would typically want to hide. However, because there are so many other institutions, so many researchers outside of the control of the West who have been documenting the fact that Africa is facing the worst catastrophe, it kind of forces these big institutions to admit the truth. And so I think this is an instance where they do have to admit the horrible effects that climate change is poised to have on the African continent. It says, as global warming continues to worsen, the effects of climate change will force people worldwide to migrate to new areas to survive. Africa is expected to be among the hardest hit by climate change if actions aren't quickly taken by 2050. The situation will be so dire that up to 86 million people will have to leave their homes. That's what the World Bank, again, is reporting. The regions, according to the report, have contributed to the least global warming, yet are expected to experience the most devastating impacts of climate change. Just the irony, right? So going down to another article also reporting on this, it says, in Africa, climate change is increasing hunger and poverty, polluted water, dying livestock, widespread infectious disease, extreme storms, swarms of locusts. It sounds like something from the plagues of Egypt detailed in the book of Exodus, but these are just a handful of the climate-related threats Africa is facing today.
Here in Africa, extreme weather patterns are already wreaking havoc in many nations. In 2019 and much of 2020, parts of East and West Africa were hit by floods, leaving a trail of death and destruction. The region is also recovering from two devastating cyclones, which resulted in deaths and the displacement of thousands. The cyclones also destroyed crop production, leaving aid agencies to respond to multiple humanitarian crises.
The scars of Cyclone Idai are visible. However, authorities and aid workers believe that they have the cholera outbreak under control.
A desert locust invasion that started in the Horn of Africa has added to the region's woes. Crops that were planted by smallholder farmers have been destroyed by the pests. Meanwhile, weather experts have been predicting a drought on the heels of these floods. It seems when it rains, it pours in Africa. Even sunny spells are no longer normal. They're often searingly hot and accompanied by food and water shortages. This is climate change at play.
Today,
and it's
of the Earth's 7 continents, Africa contributes, again, the least to climate change per capita on a per capita basis, excluding ice and snow-bound Antarctica, of course. But Africans are paying the most heavy price for the rest of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. The result, according to a multi-agency report from the World Meteorological Organization, is a looming disaster that threatens the lives and livelihoods of tens of millions of people in the near future. Now, this article is saying by 2030, it is estimated that up to 118 million extremely poor will be exposed to drought, floods, and extreme heat in Africa if adequate response measures aren't put in place. So when I tell you all, we are living in a state of emergency, I think that can kind of go in some of our areas and out of some of our areas, but I'm trying to get us to understand this is a state of emergency, the colonial position that we are in. The fact that, number one, obviously, we're people who are starving just because someone else controls our resources, someone else controls our destinies, and these people have been hoarding and overusing and overconsuming and leaving us in a position where we have no way out. That's a horrible, horrible reality to live for any people. And then on top of that, these same people are literally destroying our environment, destroying Africa, not just climate change. There's been so many documented instances of things being done, whether it's corporations that are dumping waste into sources of water, whether it's our air that's being polluted, whether it's taking our rainforests or our jungles and turning it into some type of complex or whatever. Like, these are things that are happening right now. But of course, on top of that, a lot of people are dying. And of course, we know death is a final thing for any person. So let's not take these things lightly. This is a state of emergency and something that's affecting us day to day. And just ending out with this article, it says the African Union's Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture says that extremely poor people who are going to be affected are those who are living on $1.90 a day. So we're going to talk about this in more detail. We're going to talk about who's to blame, but who I think should be looked at as doing things without any conscious towards the effects that are going to happen, to the point where I would say that it has to be intentional. But before we get there, we're going to talk about a number of stories that are happening throughout the African world. So let's transition to different news stories that we're going to cover today. Y'all, my prayers are really with the country of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has declared a nationwide state of emergency. And I feel like the African diaspora and the African continent has to really come to Ethiopia's aid. If we remember, Ethiopia technically was not a country that was colonized in Africa, the only country that was not colonized in Africa, although you could say that they were colonized during World War II, whenever the Italians essentially took siege of Ethiopia. And also during that time, if you don't know, Africans throughout the world, but particularly I know of Africans inside of the United States, really took this serious, because this is the one sovereign African country and you think you're going to just overrun it. And we really came out in support. So I'm hoping that we could do something similar, understanding that as of right now, I believe that the reason why Ethiopia is being punished is because they're doing things to try to assert their sovereignty, as we've talked about, trying to assert their sovereignty over a dam that Egypt has laid claim to. And Egypt, of course, is being backed by the West in this. And possibly some other things that we're not aware of. But for whatever reason, the United States and the imperialist actors have put a target on Ethiopia's back, just as they have with Eritrea. And we've seen this happening throughout the Tigray crisis. So Ethiopia's cabinet has declared a nationwide state of emergency effective immediately, and authorities in Addis Ababa told citizens to prepare to defend the capital as fighters from northern region of Tigray threatened to march towards the city. The state of emergency is aimed to protect civilians from atrocities being committed by the terrorist TPLF group in several parts of the country. That's what the news media said inside of Ethiopia. The 6-month state of emergency allows, among other things, for roadblocks to be established, transport services to be disrupted, curfews to be imposed, and for the military to take over in certain areas. So this is something that's very serious. And of course, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, this is a major part of Africa, people. This is a major part of African stability. And if this were to happen, if Ethiopia were to fall inside of any type of way, this would have devastating effects throughout all of Africa. I actually want to add, I had read from the Ethiopian president, Abiy Ahmed. He posted on his Twitter just this morning how the United Nations actually finished their inquiry into the human rights abuses that the whole international community was accusing Ethiopia of towards TPLF. And while they said they found some, this is from the United Nations, they did say that it has been blown way out of proportion as opposed to what has been reported on. So we can kind of see how things are lining up. We see who's being supported by who. If you don't know, the TPLF is supported by the United States. This is always something that's concerning. Anytime that you see a foreign power, particularly one that has a history of intentionally enforcing regime change inside of African countries whenever they try to assert their sovereignty, you see that same country actually making intentional efforts to support a group, going out of their way, whether it's the news coverage, whether it's sending military aid. And that's the question you all should be asking. How is it that this small group of people are able to do this much damage? I promise you all they're being supported by the U.S. military. And then to top it all off, America really showed its colors, because out of all of the human rights atrocities happening throughout the world, they decided to inflict sanctions on Ethiopia. Now, even let's say that the worst that has been reported is what's actually happening, that what has been reported by these news institutions is what's actually happening. If you're going to be even-handed to the United States, there's not just one country that you would target with these sanctions. Many countries, particularly those who are very close to the United States, would also be targeted with these same sanctions. But whenever you see one country being sought after and being plagued with all of this news coverage, we know that something's up. I hope we've learned from Libya not to trust the West. I hope we've learned from so many instances of regime change that they do not have our interest in mind, and that we will stand in solidarity with Ethiopia. So please, people, keep this story in your hearts and your prayers, and let's really make sure that we're showing solidarity with what's happening there. Another imperialist meeting is happening, and this is the G20. Now, it's interesting. There's all these G conferences, and this one actually had some African leaders that were invited to come. So the G20 summit opens with, of course, because whenever Africans are there, this has to be the reason, calls for more vaccines for poor nations. Rich countries have used vaccines, this is what the article is saying, and stimulus spending to restart their economic activities, leaving the risk that developing countries that account for much of the global growth will remain behind due to low vaccinations and financing difficulties. President Joe Biden and Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of the Congo have discussed a U.S. brokered deal between pharmaceutical maker Moderna and the African Union to make up 110 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine available to the continent. Participants at the meeting included Chancellor Angela Merkel, the EU Commissioner, Angela Merkel's been in power for a long time, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and EU President Charles Michel, as well as African Union President Felix Tshisekedi and Rwandan President Paul Kagame. Him again. The heads of state who were invited was South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa and Macky Sall from Senegal. Interesting who gets chosen and who doesn't, obviously. So a few things that are coming out of this, and we're going to talk about this more this weekend on the WCC We Charge Colonialism's podcast and book club. You should check us out Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern time. And we're going to get into this more, but curious to hear your all thoughts as far as why this is the big talking point whenever Africans are involved. It seems every time that something's involving them. If it's just the West meeting by themselves, they want to talk about how to, organize to take on China. But if Africans are involved, it's about how to push vaccines inside of the African continent, particularly Moderna, United States sponsored vaccine. Another story we'll be covering this weekend on WCC's podcast and book club is the fact that in the United States, Black Lives Matter movement has seemed to be waning off as far as having support by politicians who are supposed to be representing Africans inside of these communities. So it's interesting that all of a sudden, after George Floyd died, we've seen a wave of support by different politicians that they said they want to support the African movement and try to work on some type of, they say, police reform. Of course, some people were saying things more extreme, like abolish the police, and that might have something directly to do with the fact that the pendulum has swung back. And now we're seeing something similar to the rhetoric that came out inside of the 1990s, early 1990s, whenever people were talking about law and order. These same politicians are now using similar rhetoric. So we're going to talk about this more, but it's something, again, that you should be aware of. This is another reminder of similar things that have happened to us in the past, when the pendulum swings backwards and forwards, forward and backwards, depending on what's happening at the moment. The second that we stop showing mass mobilization efforts, the second the system feels like things have cooled off and the system goes back to the system as normal. All right, so let's talk about the climate crisis that's being created for Africa. Deliver on promises, developing world tells rich at the climate talks. Now, deliver on promises is not an assertive statement. That's you asking for your oppressor to please stop oppressing me. And this is something that we see happen all the time whenever it comes to these international meetings or international bodies. There's never a demand because it's not being backed by power. These are countries that are dependent on the West, asking the West to please stop harming us or please do something about something. That already is going to tell you that these countries are not in an authoritative position. And really, it's up to the West of whether or not they want to honor anything. Talking things out never means that your oppressor is going to stop oppressing you. Only having the power to ensure that they have no ability to oppress you, that's whenever you're going to be able to see a real change. Now, a crucial United Nations conference heard calls on its first day for the world's major economies to keep their promises of financial help to address the climate crisis, while big polluters, India and Brazil, made new commitments to cut emissions. World leaders, environmental experts, and activists all pleaded for decisive action to halt the global warming, which threatens the future of the planet, at the start of the 2-week COP26 summit in the Scottish city of Glasgow on Monday. In 2009, the developed countries most responsible for global warming pledged, the United States and I believe US and China were neck and neck at one point, pledged to provide $100 billion US by 2020 to help developing countries deal with its consequences. The commitment has not been met, generating mistrust and reluctance among some developing nations to accelerate their emissions reductions. And of course, this is very crazy. They're meeting right now on this issue. They made a promise: we're going to give $100 billion to developing nations to help with the crisis that we created. But since then, not only have they not done that, they're continuing the same trends as far as carbon emissions. So what are you even promising at this point? Are you promising that, hey, I'll keep promising and then keep doing more damage while I keep promising? It's nothing that's actual. And this is a problem that, again, we don't have power, so we have to take what they give us. Now, leaders of countries such as Kenya and Bangladesh, Barbados, and Malawi call rich nations to task for failing to deliver. They said the money pledged to least developed nations by developed nations is not a donation, but a cleaning fee. Neither Africa in general nor Malawi in particular will take no for an answer anymore. Again, more things being said without power to back it, because you depend on the people who are doing you harm. Now, it's important to keep in mind, if they actually got $100 billion, would that have actually been able to reverse the climate crisis, even assuming these neo-colonial governments actually did it with the money, what they're supposed to do with the money. I don't think so. As I said, the countries that are responsible for the current crisis are the ones that continue polluting the most. So that's the reality, and that's not going to change unless there's going to be something very, as I said in the beginning of the video, revolutionary that's going to change that. I also want to point out the obvious fact that the two countries that are saying that they're going to start cutting down, still quote unquote developing countries, that's Brazil and also India. Isn't it interesting that Brazil and India are being touted as successes, decolonialized successes? That's what they're telling us, because these countries were colonies of Britain and I believe Brazil, Spain, or Portugal. And yet these countries at this particular moment are becoming the world's fastest growing economies. And that kind of shows you that climate change has a lot to do with development. And this is why I think people, again, have to question, what do you mean by development? Because the countries that we call developed are developed as far as creating these big cities. And big cities means more carbon emissions. And unfortunately, development has not meant anything for African people that's going to reverse the roles, give us power, and give us control over our environments. So again, putting those definitions out there to say that we need to change the definition of development. It's not having skyscrapers. It's not having all these cars and all this traffic. Development has to be development of the human quality of life, development of our relationship to our environment, to our communities. And if any type of development that you have offered us does not include those things, then we reject it and say that it's illegitimate. Another interesting aspect of the climate change issue is that, of course, as the imperialists do, they try to shift the blame. So it's not even like, hey, we're the most responsible for this, we really need to cut down. But it's like, hey, everyone needs to cut down. And even you Africans, you guys need to have more green energy and everything. Which is, very silly, because again, even if there are ways, obviously, that we do need to have better control over things like pollution, and these things exist in Africa too. If we're talking about the specific issue of climate change, we know the countries that are responsible. In fact, I'm going to show you a map right here. This is a map of the countries that are most responsible for climate change as of 2017. So we can see exactly what's happening, that the developed, again, quote unquote developed countries are the ones controlling really the destinies of the whole world. And unfortunately, Africa has no way to have leverage in this situation, because Africa is dominated by foreign interests. And yet these same foreign interests want to place the blame on Africa. Now, there was an interesting comment that came out from Tangai Gahuma Bakai. He said, we cannot just ask African countries to stop exploiting their coal, oil, and gas, because developed nations have already used these resources to fund their development, and we need to develop ourselves. And he is he's in Gabon. He's the chair of the African Group of Negotiators. That was a very silly comment to me. So he's saying essentially, hey, West, don't blame us Africans. We have to develop our country just like you developed yours. This is not development. If this is what you call development, exploiting your resources, then that has to very much be questioned, because it has never, ever in the history of Africa been the case that capitalism has led to better conditions for the masses. Now, even if, what he's saying was true, let's just use one example. I pulled up some stats from the coal mining companies inside of Africa. If you look at the companies, I'm going to, the top 85% producers of coal, I'm going to list the companies. Anglo American PLC. You guys can probably figure out who owns that. Sasol Mining, that's a white-owned company inside of South Africa. Glencore, we know they come out of Britain. Exxaro, that is a white-owned company. They have something interesting on their website, actually. It says Black Empowered company, but they're still white-owned. And Black Empowered basically means they give opportunities to Africans, which is crazy. But then there's another one, South 32, South Africa Energy Coal. It's another white-owned company. So vast majority are in South Africa. All of them are controlled by European interests. That shows you, whenever they say that Africans, you're going to use these materials for our own development, you're not. Other people are using them for their development. Instead, we're giving back secondhand, third-hand usage of something that actually originated in Africa. And that's just the story of how colonialism has really perverted our ability to even have leverage, even over something that comes out of our land. See the issues that have been presented before us, African people. Literally, we don't control our resources that are being taken by outsiders, and these same resources are causing a global climate crisis. On top of those things, the people who cause the crisis don't have to deal with the consequences. We're dealing with the consequences. And so at some point, I think when we talk about these things over and over again with no solution brought forth to the table, we should ask more precise questions. Is this being done on purpose? That's what I want to know. Is this being done even recklessly, hey, we don't care, what happens, or is this being done intentionally? Now, let's just read a little bit about the climate crisis as far as who's to blame. Again, we said the West is to blame, but more specifically, it says the rich people are the primary ones to blame for the climate crisis. The wealthiest tenth of people consume about 20 times more energy overall than the bottom tenth wherever they live, this article says. The Gulf is greatest in transport, where the top 10th gobble 187 times more fuel than the poorest 10th. That's because people on the lowest incomes can rarely afford to drive. Now, we see very clearly the divisions that are presented. You have the West being the main ones causing the global climate crisis, and then you also see the rich. Now, consider that with this last article I'm going to read from. It says, it sounds like a dystopian science fiction novel as climate change cooks oceans and forests, a pandemic endangers billions of people, and world hunger surges. A handful of mega wealthy men are pumping billions of dollars into their own personal space travel companies. Who are we talking about? Obviously, that's Jeff Bezos. Now it says, but it's happening right now, and David Beasley, the head of the World Food Program, thinks the money could be put to better use. Now, he called on Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, and Elon Musk to contribute $6 billion needed to save 41 million people in 43 countries who are at risk of starving this year. $6 billion might sound like a lot to you, but not to these people. As it says in the article, this might sound like a big ask, but these billionaires, with the amount that they make, is pocket change. Jeff Bezos is worth $192.6 billion. Branson is worth $6.3 billion, and Musk is worth $165.9 billion. And I'm sure Elon Musk worth one up more since then. Together, that's $364 billion, which could prevent people from starving to death 60 times over. Now, if you think about how the world's wealth is completely over inside of a small corner of the world's population, you have a very small amount of people who are controlling the vast majority of the money. These same people, of course, as we said, the rich people are the ones to blame for the climate crisis. We can assume that the richest people are currently the ones who probably causing a lot of this havoc. Not just Western countries, but specifically the people who are on the top of the top of the top. They have a direct part inside of this whole thing that's happening to the world. Would it be too much for these people to give a small amount of money to help, this crisis that they created? Well, common sense said it wouldn't be too much. I mean, I've seen one article asking a very important question. Where did it become okay to watch people starve to death? And that's a very big question. If it could actually be a small amount of your money that would stop so many people from dying, why is this something that has to be asked for? And that's the question. I would like to pose to everyone that this is not being done just for the sake of, hey, we're living our best lives and we don't see what's going on. These people see exactly what's going on. They know what's going on. They have advisors. They have close governmental relationships. And if they wanted to stop it, they have the ability to stop it. Even just make sure, hey, we'll keep colonizing you, but we'll at least make sure you don't starve while we're doing it. They have that ability. They have all of that ability, and yet they choose not to. And I have to believe that if you're choosing not to, you have an agenda for not doing so. And so the question is on us. Why do we accept these people? Why do we accept them inside of our worlds? Why do we accept them inside of our countries? A lot of these people can easily just come into Africa and, do a trip, a state visit, and then leave out without any protests. Well, in fact, some people will even celebrate that some of these people will even give them their presents. Some of us are wired like that. Why do you accept people who are purposefully watching you starve, watching this world go to shambles, watching humanity dying off, and the first ones who suffer the most are Africans? Why are we accepting these people as legitimate? That's the question that I would like to pose to all of you. So I love to hear your comments. And of course, I will see you on the next video. Hey family, this is Tierney Cherie. I'm here to make an announcement that I'm very, very excited to make. I'm excited because I really think this is something that is important for our people. Otherwise, I would not have devoted so much time and energy towards it. So I finished my first book, and the book title is Fostering False Identity, the Child Welfare System's Design of Social Control of the Black Family. Now, why is this book something that I think will be very important for our community? Well, number one, it's dealing with the system of white supremacy, particularly the way that the system has targeted our children. If you don't know, our children are literally our future. Without our children, we have no future. And so understand that the system is very crafty when figuring out what to derail first. And to me, it's no mistake that the system particularly went after the Black family. If you look at what happened whenever we were enslaved by this system, and continues to go after the Black family, continues to go after Black children, continues to try to villainize African parents. So for that, I wanted to particularly talk about this subject. Now, the other thing that the book will deal with is our African identities. Why is it that our African identities are a threat to the system? Why is it that whenever we want to identify ourselves as being African, we get so much drawback inside of the Black community? I think a lot of us are not aware of the history of assimilationist thought inside of our community, this idea that we have to be close to white in order to be accepted. And so that's another subject that we delve into in this book. So I'm hoping that anyone who is, obviously, if you're a parent, a Black parent, and you really want to understand why it is that these systems are going after your children, I encourage you to read this book. I hope that it will arm you with a lot of knowledge and a lot of foresight, not just about how to protect your own children, but how to organize in your community, because that's really the purpose of the book, is to say that we have to organize among ourselves in order to protect ourselves from this white supremacist system. And then obviously, if you're an organizer in general, this is something that I think is important for you to read, because like I said, this is a subject in the Black community that we just don't discuss enough. Child welfare is not something that is going to get enough attention. People obviously will organize them around other causes, but this is one that is really important that I feel like we have to pay more attention to.